You'll bless her the way a fading star blesses the dawn, Elira, gracefully, and then you'll have the decency to disappear." That was how King Alaric of Highmark told his queen of 6 winters that she had been replaced, not with an apology, not with a private word, but standing in the great hall with his hand already resting on another woman's waist, his voice carrying to the rafters where the old banners of her marriage still hung. Elira felt it before she understood it. The way you feel a bone break a heartbeat before the pain arrives. A cold, ripping sensation beneath her ribs, as though someone had reached into her chest and severed a cord that had grown there for years. The mate bond. She had heard the elders describe its breaking as a mercy compared to what she felt now, a slow tearing rather than a clean cut, the frayed ends of it curling and burning inside her, while Alaric watched her face and mistook her stillness for acceptance. Blood drained from her cheeks. The torchlight seemed to dim. Somewhere a courtier laughed, a bright, cruel little sound, and beside the king stood Seraphine of the Ashcroft line, gowned in silver, her chin tilted at the precise angle of a woman who has already measured a room and found herself its owner. Elira did not scream. She did not weep. She stood there in the hall she had rebuilt from ruin, the hall whose ledgers she had balanced, and whose treaties she had brokered, and whose people she had fed through 2 starving winters, and she let the silence stretch until it became a thing the whole court could feel pressing on their shoulders. Then she said, very quietly, only to herself, so quietly that not even the king caught it, "You have no idea what you are letting walk out the door." And in that single breath, the story of the rest of her life turned on its axis, because a woman who chooses silence over screaming is not a woman who has surrendered. She is a woman who has already begun to plan. For 6 years, Elira had been the lunar queen of Highmark, and for 6 years she had been useful. That was the word Alaric had used once, early, when he still bothered with tenderness, useful, and she had been too in love to hear the poison folded inside it. She had come to him, a minor lord's daughter, with no dowry worth the ink to record it, but with a mind like a steel trap and a memory that forgot nothing, and within a single season she had understood the machinery of his kingdom better than any adviser who had served 3 generations. It was Elira who noticed that the grain tithes from the western holdfasts were being skimmed. It was Elira who redrew the borders of the hunting grounds so the packs stopped bleeding each other over deer. It was Elira who sat awake through the night of the silver pine plague, mixing wolfsbane tinctures with the old healer Maren until the fever broke, and it was Elira who signed the accord of the Twin Rivers with her own hand and her own blood mark, binding the 2 great trade routes of the north into a single ribbon of prosperity that ran straight through Highmark's gates. She had made the kingdom rich. She had made Alaric a king worth envying, and she had done it all so quietly, so without appetite for glory, that the court had come to see her the way one sees a load-bearing wall, necessary, unremarkable, and utterly taken for granted until the day someone knocks it down and the roof caves in. Seraphine was the opposite of a load-bearing wall. She was a chandelier, brilliant and suspended, dependent on the ceiling to which she was bolted. Her father was Lord Malachar Ashcroft, master of the Ashfell Reaches, a man whose smile had buried more rivals than any blade, and when Malachar had offered his daughter to Alaric, along with 3,000 warriors and the promise of the southern iron mines, the king had looked at his tireless, brilliant, unglamorous wife and decided she was a price he was willing to pay. That was the arithmetic of it. Elira understood arithmetic better than anyone in that hall, which was precisely why she understood, in the moment the bond snapped, exactly how the sums had been done and exactly how badly Alaric had miscalculated, because Malachar had not offered his daughter to enrich Highmark. Malachar had offered his daughter to inherit it. Elira had seen the shape of the trap in the marriage contract weeks before, when a copy had crossed her desk, and she had noticed the clause tucked between provisions on tribute and title, a clause that named any child of Seraphine and Alaric as the sole and undivided heir, superseding all prior claims, and a second clause, subtler still, that granted the Ashcroft line stewardship of the kingdom should the king fall before that heir came of age. She had gone to Alaric with the contract. She had laid it before him, and told him plainly that he was signing away his throne to a wolf wearing a bride's veil. And Alaric had looked at her over the rim of his wine, and said the words she would carry out of that hall like stones in her pockets. Jealousy is beneath a queen, Elira. Or perhaps it is not. And that is why you were never quite a queen at all. So she had stopped arguing. She had stopped, and she had started planning, and the court had mistaken her quiet for defeat. The ceremony was set for the night of the blood moon, 3 weeks hence, when Elira would stand before the assembled Pax and speak the words of blessing that would legitimize Seraphine as the new Luna, and dissolve her own bond in the eyes of the moon goddess. Until then, she was to remain in the palace, a ghost haunting the rooms she had ruled, expected to perform her own erasure with grace. She agreed to everything. She lowered her eyes and let Alaric believe he had broken her, and she went to her chambers and she began, methodically, to take her kingdom apart in the only ways that mattered. Not with fire, not with blood, but with parchment. The first thing Elira did that night was not weep, though she wanted to, the grief pressing behind her eyes like flood water against a door. The first thing she did was light a single candle and pull from beneath a loose stone in the hearth a slim iron box she had hidden there in her 2nd year of marriage, back when love had not yet blinded her to the wisdom of keeping something for herself. Inside the box were 3 things. A ring, not the wedding band Alaric had given her, which she intended to leave on his pillow, like a coin left for a ferryman, but a plain signet of her own family, worn thin, the only thing her dead mother had left her. A bag of silver, saved a coin at a time over years, skimmed from her own allowance, and never from the treasury, because Elira had promised herself long ago that whatever she took when she left, she would be able to say before the goddess that it had been hers. And a letter, sealed but unsent, addressed in her own hand to a name most of the Highmark court had learned to fear, Kaelan, Alpha of Night River. Night River was the pack to the north, beyond the Black Pines, a hard people who had never bent the knee to Highmark and never would, and Kaelan was their young Alpha, a man Elira had met exactly twice, once across a negotiating table when he had come to renew the border pacts, and once in the margins of that same meeting when he had lingered, studying the treaty she had drafted, and said the only words anyone in 6 years had said that made her feel seen. You wrote all of this. Not the king. You. It had not been flattery. There had been no warmth in it, only recognition, the flat professional respect of one competent creature acknowledging another, and Elira had never forgotten it, because it was the opposite of useful. It was true. She did not send the letter that night. She was not ready, and readiness, she had learned, was the difference between escape and capture. Instead, she moved through the following days as a model of gracious defeat. She smiled at Seraphine in the corridors. She answered the younger woman's needling questions about the household with unhurried patience, and when Seraphine, flush with new power, ordered Elira to hand over the great ledger of the kingdom, the vast bound book in which every debt, every tithe, every treaty and grain store and iron shipment of Highmark was recorded in Elira's own tight, precise hand, Elira handed it over without a flicker. She placed the ledger in Seraphine's arms and watched the young woman stagger slightly under its weight, and she said, "You'll want to keep the Western accounts current. The holdfasts pay in the autumn." Seraphine had laughed and said she had scribes for such tedium, and Elira had inclined her head and thought, with the first cold spark of something that was not quite joy, but was adjacent to it. You have no scribes who understand what is written there, because the ledger Elira surrendered was true in every figure and utterly useless without the woman who had built it. It recorded that the Western holdfasts owed grain, but not that the grain existed only because Elira had personally negotiated the seed loans that made the harvest possible, loans that came due the moment her signature was no longer honored. It recorded that the Twin Rivers Accord brought silver through the gates, but not that the accord was a personal instrument, sworn to Elira's blood mark, valid only so long as she lived and consented, a detail buried in the ancient lore of pack treaties that Alaric had never bothered to read, and Seraphine could not have understood. Highmark's wealth was not a treasury, it was a spell, and Elira was the word that held it together, and she was about to stop speaking it. Over the next 2 weeks she did small, quiet, devastating things. She wrote to the Western Holdfast lords, in her capacity as Luna, one last time, and reminded them courteously that the seed loans were due at the turning of the season, and that the crown would surely honor them as always. She did not tell them she was leaving. She did not need to. She only needed the reminders on record, so that when the loans came due and the crown could not pay, because only Elira knew from which reserve they were meant to be paid, a reserve she had built and quietly emptied into her own careful accounts under an old contingency clause that named the Luna, not the king, as its trustee. The holdfasts would turn on Highmark, not as rebels but as creditors. She met with Maren, the old healer, in the herb-drying room where they had saved so many lives together, and she did not ask the old woman to keep a secret, because she knew Maren would offer it. "You're going," Maren said, not looking up from the bundle of dried moon petal in her spotted hands. "I've watched you these last days. You've the look of a woman folding up her tent." Elira did not deny it. Maren nodded slowly and said, "The old law protects a Luna who is cast off. She may claim safe passage to any pack that will have her, and no wolf may hunt her on the road under pain of the goddess's judgment. Alaric has forgotten that law. His father never forgot it." And then Maren pressed into Elira's hands a small clay token stamped with the moon and thorn of the Healers' Guild, and said, "Show this at Night River's gate. Kaelin's grandmother was a healer before she was an alpha's mate. They honor the sisterhood there. They'll not turn you away." It was the first kindness Elira had received since the bond broke, and it undid her more than any cruelty had. She wept then, briefly, fiercely, into the old woman's shoulder, and Maren held her and said the only comfort worth giving. "You were the best of them, girl, and they'll not know it until it's too late to matter." The night before the ceremony, Elira left the palace of Highmark with less than she had arrived with, and that was exactly as she intended it. She left the wedding band on Alaric's pillow, the great emerald that had been her badge of office for 6 years, and beside it she left the crown circlet of the Luna, and beside that she left a single sheet of parchment on which she had written nothing at all because she wanted him to understand, when he found it, that she had considered leaving him her reasons, and had decided he was not owed them. She took her mother's signet, her bag of honest silver, Maren's clay token, and the sealed letter to Kaelan, which she now carried not to send, but to deliver in person. She dressed as a travelling healer in undyed wool, and she braided her hair the plain way of the road, and she slipped out through the herb garden gate where the guard was a boy she had once paid for his sister's medicine, a boy who looked at her and looked at the moon and turned his back so that he might honestly say he had seen nothing. The threshold of the outer wall was the hardest step she had ever taken, not because she feared the road, she had feared worse things and survived them, but because to cross it was to sever the last living thread of the self she had been. On the palace side of that wall was Elyra the Lunar Queen, brilliant and betrayed, a woman who had poured 6 years of her life into a man who traded her for iron. On the far side was a woman with no title, no pack, no name that any door would open for, walking north into the black pines with a healer's token and a stubborn heart. She crossed. She did not look back, because looking back is for people who are not certain of their direction, and Elyra had never in her life been more certain of anything. She walked all night, and slept the day in a shepherd's abandoned fold, and walked again the next night, and on the 3rd day she came to the edge of the silver pine forest, where the black pines of Night River began, and it was there, at dawn, that she felt the bond die completely. She had thought it dead already, but there had been a filament of it left, thin as spider silk, stretching all the way back to Duskhaven, and at the precise hour when the blood moon rose, and Alaric spoke the words of dissolution over an altar where his cast-off queen was supposed to be kneeling in blessing, that last filament burned away, and Elyra fell to her knees in the wet ferns and pressed her hands to her chest and made a sound she had never made before, a low animal keening that frightened the birds from the trees. It hurt. Goddess, it hurt. A phantom limb where a whole life had been. But when it was over, when the last of it had guttered out, and there was nothing left in her chest but her own heartbeat, hers and no one else's, she found that she could breathe in a way she had not breathed in years. The air tasted of pine and cold water and freedom. She stood up. She wiped her face, and she walked into Night River. Meanwhile, in the great hall of Highmark, the ceremony of the blood moon was not going as King Alaric had planned. He had stood at the altar in his finest, seraphine radiant beside him. 300 guests assembled, the elders robed and the incense burning, and he had waited for his former queen to be led in so that she might speak the words that would seal his new marriage in the eyes of the goddess. And Elyra had not come. The steward had gone to fetch her and found her chambers empty, a ring on a pillow, a crown beside it, a blank page. The whisper had gone around the hall like a crack racing across ice, and by the time it reached Alaric on the dais, he had gone white and then red, and Seraphine had gripped his arm and hissed something in his ear, and the elders had exchanged the grave, slow looks of men who know a very old law has just been broken, because a dissolution requires the consent and blessing of the cast-off mate, freely given. That was the ancient rule, older than Highmark itself, written into the bones of pack law when the first wolves learned to howl at the moon. Without Elyra's blessing, the bond between Alaric and Elyra wasn't severed in the eyes of the goddess. It was merely abandoned. And a bond abandoned rather than blessed is a curse upon the one who abandoned it. The elders had murmured this into the ringing silence of the hall, their faces grim, and Alaric had roared for them to be silent, to proceed anyway, to speak the words and be done. They had spoken the words, and every wolf in that hall had felt the wrongness of it, the way a false note wrongs a song, and Seraphine had smiled through it, because Seraphine did not believe in old laws, only in iron and blood and her father's schemes. But the goddess, the elders would say afterward, in low voices, is patient, and she is precise, and she keeps her own ledger, and every debt entered in it comes due. Alaric had married his iron bride under a curse of his own making, and he had lost his true queen in the same hour. And though he did not yet know it, he had also lost the only person alive who knew how to keep his kingdom from falling apart. The blood moon set. The season turned, and in the west the seed loans came due. 6 months later, the black pines of Night River stood under a hard, clean winter sky, and the woman the northern pack called simply the strategist stood on the ramparts of Frosthold and watched the caravans come in. She wore grey wolfskin against the cold, and her dark hair was bound back in the plain northern way, and there was nothing in her bearing to suggest she had ever knelt at a southern altar or worn a Luna's crown. Elira had not taken a title in Night River. She had not needed one. She had arrived at their gate a healer with a clay token and a letter, and she had been given a bed in the guest hall and a wary courtesy, and within a week she had done what she always did. She had looked at the machinery of the place and seen where it groaned. Night River was rich in warriors and poor in everything else. They were a fierce, proud, disorganized people who won every battle and lost every winter, who could not have negotiated a trade agreement to save their lives, who let their furs rot in storehouses because no one had ever thought to build a road south to sell them. Elira had looked at all of this, and, without being asked, she had begun to fix it. She drew Cailan a map of the trade routes that Highmark had monopolized, and showed him the 3 that ran through Night River land that no one had ever exploited. She sat with their storemasters and taught them to record what they had, so they would stop starving in the spring on top of last autumn's forgotten surplus. She wrote the pack's first real treaty with the river clans to the east, a treaty so favorable that the river clans signed it, believing they had cheated Night River, when in truth Elira had given away 100 deerskins to gain 1,000 bushels of grain, and Cailan, the young hard-eyed alpha who trusted no one, had watched this stranger reorder his kingdom in a season, and had come to her one night in the map room and said, plainly, without ornament, "I don't know who you were before you came here. You've never said, and I've never asked. But whatever pack was fool enough to lose you deserves whatever the winter does to it." Elira had looked up from her ledger, a new ledger, Night River's ledger, begun in her own tight, precise hand, and she had smiled, a small, real smile, the first in longer than she could remember. "They were fools," she agreed, "but I don't want their winter. I want their spring." She had not told him everything then, but she told him some of it over the following weeks, in the slow way that trust is built between 2 people who have both been betrayed by softness and learned to prefer the truth. She told him she had been a queen. She told him she had been traded for iron. She did not tell him about the seed loans or the Twin Rivers Accord or the reserve she had emptied under a contingency clause, because those were weapons, and Elira had learned to keep her weapons sheathed until the moment they could not be parried. And Cailan, who had a warrior's respect for a hidden blade, did not press. What grew between them was not the fever of the old bond. It was something Elira had not known to want, a partnership of equals, a respect that did not require her to be small, a warmth that appeared in rare, earned moments, and landed all the harder for its rarity. When Cailan brought her the first bolt of southern cloth their new trade had bought, and laid it before her without a word, she understood it was a thank you, and a courtship, and an acknowledgment all at once, and she kept it, and she wore it, and she said nothing because nothing needed saying. Meanwhile, The intelligence came north in fragments, carried by traders and refugees and the occasional deserter, and Elira assembled the fragments the way she assembled everything into a picture no one else could see. Highmark was dying. The seed loans had come due in the autumn, and the crown could not pay them, because only Elira had known which reserve they drew upon, and that reserve was gone. The Western holdfasts, unpaid and furious, had closed their gates and kept their grain, and the first hungry murmurs had begun in Duskhaven by the first frost. Worse, the Twin Rivers Accord had collapsed the moment Elira's blood mark ceased to honor it, and the great river of silver that had run through Highmark's gates for 6 years had simply stopped, diverted by clans who no longer had any reason to route their trade through a kingdom that could no longer guarantee the road. Alaric had raged. Alaric had sent men to reopen the accord and discovered, to his fury, that the treaty was not a document, but a person, and that person had vanished. And Seraphine's father, Lord Malachar Ashcroft, had watched all of this from Ashfell, with the patient smile of a man whose plan is unfolding exactly as designed, because Malachar had never wanted a prosperous Highmark. He had wanted a desperate one. A desperate king is a king who borrows, and a king who borrows from his own father-in-law is a king who wakes up one morning to discover he has borrowed away his throne. Malachar had begun, that winter, to lend Alaric iron and grain and silver, and to take in return small, quiet concessions, a fortress here, a tithe right there, the loyalty of a border lord, the wardship of a strategic pass, until the map of Highmark was slowly, invisibly, being redrawn in Ashcroft blue. Elira saw it. She saw it from 300 miles away, in fragments, and she understood it completely, and she said nothing to anyone except Kaelin, to whom she said one sentence one night as they stood on the ramparts, watching the snow. The man who threw me away is being eaten alive by the man he chose over me, and he doesn't even know he's already dead. Kaelin looked at her for a long moment. And you're going to let it happen? And Elira, who had every reason to want it to happen, who could have stood on that rampart and watched Highmark burn and called it justice, surprised even herself with her answer. No, she said, because Malachar won't stop at Highmark. A man who eats one kingdom is hungry for 2, and I've grown rather fond of this one. The move that Lord Malachar made in the deep of that winter was the one Elira had been waiting for, because it was the one that would force every hidden thing into the open. With Highmark starved and indebted, and half its holdfasts in revolt, Malachar summoned King Alaric to Ashfell under the guise of a family council, and there, in a hall hung with Ashcroft blue, he laid before his son-in-law a document and a choice. The document was a formal instrument of stewardship, drafted in the airtight language of pack law, and it stated that in exchange for the forgiveness of Highmark's debts to the Ashcroft line, debts that now exceeded the value of the crown lands themselves, King Alaric would name Lord Malachar as regent and steward of Highmark, with full authority over its holdfasts, its warriors and its treasury, until such time as an heir of Seraphine's body should come of age. It was, in every way that mattered, an abdication. Alaric would remain king in name, a decorative chandelier bolted to a ceiling that Malachar now owned, and the Ashcroft line would rule in fact. And the choice Malachar offered was no choice at all, because the alternative to signing was to watch Highmark collapse into famine and rebellion within the year, its people starving, its warriors deserting, its name erased from the map. Alaric signed. He signed because he was proud and cornered and out of time, and because he still, even then, did not understand the shape of the trap he had walked into on the day he traded a load-bearing wall for a chandelier. But there was one thing Malachar had not counted on. One thread he could not tie, and it was the thread that Elira had cut and carried north 6 months before. The twin rivers accord. Because here was the arithmetic that Malachar, for all his cunning, had failed to complete. Highmark's debts were vast, but they were survivable if, and only if, the great river of silver from the Twin Rivers trade could be restored, because that silver dwarfed every loan combined. Whoever controlled Highmark controlled a kingdom that was worthless without the accord and priceless with it. Malachar had assumed the accord was a treaty, a piece of parchment that could be renegotiated, reissued, forced back into being with enough pressure on the river clans. He had sent envoys. He had sent threats, and he had discovered, as Alaric had discovered before him, that the accord was bound not to a document, but to a blood mark, and that the woman who bore that blood mark was gone, and that without her free and living consent, the greatest source of wealth in the north was simply, permanently, closed. Malachar had inherited a corpse and dressed it as a throne. And so, in the last grey weeks of that winter, the master of Ashfeld did the only thing left to him. He set his agents to find Elira. Not to kill her. Malachar was too intelligent for that, and besides, a dead Elira could no more sign the accord than an absent one. He wanted her found, and brought to him, and persuaded or coerced or purchased into restoring the flow of silver that would make his conquest of Highmark worth the having. He put out word, quietly, that the former Luna of Highmark was sought, and he offered gold for word of her, and his agents fanned out along every road and river of the north with her description in their mouths. And one of those roads led to Night River. Elira learned of it, as she learned of everything before it arrived. A River Clan trader who owed his good fortune to her treaty came north out of loyalty, rather than for pay, and told her that men bearing Ashcroft coin were asking after a dark-haired healer who had been a queen. Elira thanked him, and fed him, and sent him home richer. And then she went to find Cailan, and she told him, at last, everything. She told him about the seed loans, and the emptied reserve, and the contingency clause. She told him about the Twin Rivers Accord, and the blood mark, and the reason Highmark had died the day she walked out its gate. She told him about Malachar's long game, and the abdication Alaric had signed, and the silver river that only she could reopen. And she laid it all before him, the way she had once laid the marriage contract before Alaric, plainly, completely, holding nothing back. And then she waited to see what this second king would do with the truth that the first had thrown in her face. Cailan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You've been sitting on the key to the whole north for 6 months. You could have used it at any time. You could have opened the accord through Night River and made us the richest pack in the world overnight." "Yes," Elira said. "Why didn't you?" And Elira told him the truth, which was the same truth she had spoken on the rampart, only fuller. "Because if I opened it too soon, I'd have shown my hand while I was still weak, and Malachar would have simply taken Night River too. And because I didn't want to buy my strength, I wanted to build it. Look at what we've made here in 6 months, Cailan, with no silver river, with nothing but furs and grain and honest work. That's mine. That's ours. The accord isn't my strength. It's my proof. And I'm going to use it. But I'm going to use it when it will end this, not just win a season of it." Cailan looked at her, this woman who had walked to his gate with a healer's token, and turned out to hold the fate of 3 kingdoms in her hands, and he did something Elira had not expected. He knelt. Not as a subject, Night River knelt to no one, but as a partner, acknowledging the greater strategist, and he said, Then tell me how it ends, and tell me what you need me to do." And Elira, for the first time since the bond had broken in that far-off hall, felt the full weight of her own power settle onto her shoulders. Not as a burden, but as a fit, and she smiled the cold, clean smile of a woman who has finished her calculations. "I need you," she said, "to invite the King of Highmark to Frosthold. Send word that Night River, seeing his misfortune, offers to discuss restoring the northern trade. He'll come because he's drowning, and a drowning man will grasp any rope. And when he comes—" She paused, and something ancient and satisfied moved behind her eyes. He's going to have to look at the person he threw away, and understand at last exactly what he traded her for. The invitation went south in the last thaw of the year, sealed with the black wolf of Night River, and it did exactly what Elira had promised it would do. King Alaric of Highmark, a king in name whose kingdom now moved to Ashcroft Strings, received the offer of the fierce northern pack to discuss restoring the great trade of the Twin Rivers, and he grasped it like a drowning man grasps a rope, because it was the one thing that might yet break Malakar's hold on his throat. If Alaric could reopen the northern silver himself, through Night River, he could pay his debts, escape his father-in-law's stewardship, and reclaim a kingdom that was slipping between his fingers like sand. He did not tell Malakar he was going. That was the first interesting thing Elira learned from her watchers on the road, that Alaric travelled north in secret, with a small guard and no Ashcroft eyes, which meant the king had finally begun to understand that his father-in-law was not his ally, but his executioner, and had begun, too late and too clumsily, to fight for his life. Seraphine did not come with him. That was the second interesting thing. The Iron Bride, Elira's watchers reported, had grown thin and sharp-tongued in her half-year as Luna, hated by a starving court, ignored by a husband who had discovered too late what he had thrown away, and increasingly a stranger in her own marriage, as her father's designs made plain that Alaric had been a stepping stone, and she a mere bridge to walk across him. There was no love in that marriage, and never had been, only iron, and iron does not warm a bed on a winter night. Elira noted all of this without pleasure and without pity. She had passed beyond both. What she felt, as she prepared Frosthold to receive the man who had unmade her, was the flat, clean focus of an artisan approaching the final stroke of a long work. Alaric arrived at Frosthold in the grey light of a spring that had not yet decided to come, and he was not the man Elira remembered. The king who had stood on his dais and told his queen to disappear gracefully had been broad and golden, and certain of his place at the centre of the world. The man who dismounted in the Night River courtyard was thinner, greyer, his certainty worn down to a nub, his eyes moving too quickly. A man who had spent 6 months watching everything he owned crumble, and did not yet understand that he had lit the first spark himself. He was received with all the correct courtesy. He was given wine and warmth, and a place at the long table in Frosthold's council hall, and he was told that the Alpha of Night River and his chief strategist would attend him shortly to discuss the terms of restoring the northern trade. And so Alaric sat and drank and rehearsed his desperate arguments, and waited for the man who could save him. What came through the door was not what he expected. Kaelin entered first, the young Alpha, hard and unsmiling, and Alaric rose and made the correct greetings between kings and lesser lords, and Kaelin returned them with the barest courtesy the situation allowed. And then Kaelin said, "My chief strategist has arranged the terms. It is she who understands the northern trade better than any soul alive. You will negotiate with her, and her word in this matter is mine." And Alaric, who had expected a grizzled northern trademaster, turned toward the second figure, entering the hall with a diplomat's ready smile already fixed upon his face, and the smile died. Because the woman who walked into the council hall of Frosthold, in grey wolf skin and a bearing that filled the room, the woman upon whose word the fate of his kingdom now rested, the chief strategist of Night River, whom he had come 300 miles to beg, was Elira, his Luna, his cast-off queen, the wall he had knocked down. For a long moment, Alaric did not speak, could not speak, and Elira watched the recognition move across his face in stages, the way she had once watched betrayal move across her own, and she did not gloat, and she did not flinch. She simply crossed to the head of the table and sat and folded her hands and said, in a voice as calm and cold and level as the winter sky, "Sit down, Alaric. You wanted to discuss the northern trade. Let's discuss it." He sat. He sat because his knees would not hold him, and because 6 months of catastrophe had just rearranged themselves in his mind into a single terrible clarity, and because the woman across the table was no longer a load-bearing wall he had taken for granted, but a fortress he had besieged and lost. "Elira," he said, and her name came out, cracked. You're the... All this time I've been here," she said, "building something. While you were losing everything?" "Yes." "The Accord," he said, and she saw the last piece fall into place behind his eyes, saw him finally understand the shape of the thing that had killed his kingdom. The Twin Rivers Accord. It was never a treaty. It was you. It died because you dissolved it the moment you dissolved me, Elira said, or tried to. The Accord is bound to my blood and my consent, freely given. You had my consent for 6 years, Alaric, and you called it useful, and then you threw it on a pillow beside a crown and told me to disappear gracefully. So I did, and the Silver River went with me. You didn't lose a wife. You lost the only thing holding your kingdom together, and you handed the rest of it to a man who's been carving you up like a wintered deer ever since. Alaric flinched at Malakar's name, and Elira saw it, and she knew then that everything her watchers had told her was true, and that the king across the table had come north, not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive from a trap of his own signing. And she felt, at last, the thing she had walked away from Duskhaven to earn. Not revenge, not yet, but the clean, cold weight of holding, in her two-folded hands, the fate of the man who had thrown her away. "You want the Accord reopened," Elira said, and she did not phrase it as a question. "You want the Silver River to run through your gates again, so you can pay the debts you owe Malakar, and slip out from under his boot before he finishes swallowing your throne. That's why you're here. That's the only reason you're here." Alaric did not deny it. There was no point. She had already read the whole of his situation, the way she read everything, completely and without illusion. "Yes," he said. "Elira, the kingdom is dying. The people are starving. Whatever you think of me, and Goddess knows you've earned every bitter thought, the people of Highmark did nothing to you. They loved you. They still speak of you. If the trade doesn't reopen, there'll be famine by summer and war by autumn, and Malakar will rule over a graveyard." "I know," Elira said. "I know all of that better than you do. I know the name of every holdfast that's closed its gates and the number of grain stores in each. I know how many warriors have deserted, and which lords Malakar has bought, and what he paid for them. I know that Seraphine hasn't shared your bed since the frost, and that she calls her father twice a month by courier, and that she's already begun to wonder whether he means to make her Queen of Highmark in her own right, once you've served your purpose. I know your kingdom, Alaric, down to the last copper, because I built it, and I've spent 6 months watching the man who took it apart do it stitch by stitch. Don't tell me about the people of Highmark. I fed them through 2 winters while you hunted and feasted. I know exactly what they stand to lose. That's precisely why I'm going to be very careful about what I do next. Alaric leaned forward, and there was something in his face that had never been there in 6 years of marriage. Need, real need, and beneath it, buried but visible to a woman who had once loved him, the first raw edge of genuine remorse. "Then help them," he said. "Whatever you want, Elira. Name it. Silver, land, title. I'll make you Luna again. I'll set Seraphine aside. And Elira laughed. It was not a warm laugh, and it was not a cruel one. It was the dry, humorless laugh of a woman hearing an offer that reveals, more than any insult could, how little the man across from her had ever understood. "You'll make me Luna again," she repeated. "You'll set aside the Iron Bride and put the useful one back in her place." "Alaric, listen to yourself. You threw me away because I was useful and not decorative, and now that being useful is the only thing that can save you, you want to buy me back with the very crown you took. There's nothing you can offer me that I don't already have or can't take. I'm the chief strategist of the strongest pack in the north. I have the trust of an alpha who respects me. I have a life I built with my own hands out of nothing, and it's mine, and it can't be dissolved by a man changing his mind at an altar. That crown you're dangling isn't a prize. It's the cage I escaped. Put it away." Alaric sat back as though she had struck him, and Elira let the silence stretch, the way she had let it stretch in that far-off hall when he had unmade her, and she watched him feel the whole weight of what he had done settle onto him at last. Not as an accusation from her lips, but as a truth. He arrived at himself in the quiet. Then she said, more gently, because she had passed beyond the need to wound, "But I'll tell you what I'm going to do, because it isn't about you, and it never was going to be about you. I'm going to reopen the Twin Rivers Accord. Not for you, for the people who'll starve if I don't, and because I won't let Malachar profit from murder by neglect, but I'm going to reopen it on my terms, and here they are, and there's no negotiating them." She unrolled a document upon the table, a document she had drafted with the same precision that had once made a king rich, and Alaric looked down at it, and Cailan, standing silent by the wall, watched the woman he'd knelt to close the trap she'd been building for 6 months. "The accord reopens," Elira said, "under my blood mark, as before. But it will not run through the crown of Highmark. It will run through a new charter, held jointly by Night River and by a council of the Western Holdfasts, the very lords you failed to pay, who are owed a debt they'll be glad to see honored in silver rather than blood. The crown of Highmark will receive a share sufficient to feed its people and no more. Not 1 copper of it will pass through Malachar's hands, because the charter names the Ashcroft line explicitly excluded from any benefit, on pain of the whole accord dissolving again. Which means, Alaric, that the moment this charter is sealed, Malachar's entire scheme collapses. Highmark becomes worthless to him, because the silver he conquered it to control will flow around him like water around a stone. His loans will never be repaid, because the kingdom he lent them to will never again be rich enough to matter, and any debt he tries to call in will only hasten the famine that turns your people against him. He'll have spent a fortune in iron and cunning to purchase a corpse, and he'll be left holding the deed to a graveyard, exactly as he intended to leave you. Alaric stared at the document, and Elira watched him understand it, watched him see the whole beautiful, ruthless architecture of it, the checkmate that used no army and shed no blood and left the greater predator holding an empty trap. "This will destroy him," Alaric breathed. "It will end him," Elira agreed. "Not with a war he could win, but with arithmetic he can't argue. He built his power on the assumption that whoever holds Highmark holds the North. I'm about to prove that the North was never Highmark's to hold. It was mine. It always was. He just never bothered to read the ledger, and neither did you." And then she pushed the document across the table and set a pen beside it, and said the words that turned the whole long story on its final axis. "Sign it, Alaric. Sign away the crown's monopoly, and save your people, and end the man who's eating you alive. Or don't, and go home to Malachar, and watch it all burn. But understand this." And here her voice dropped, and the whole hall seemed to lean in to hear it. "That when you told me to disappear gracefully, you thought you were dismissing a servant. You were abdicating to a rival. You built the gallows, Alaric. I only bought the lumber." Alaric signed. He signed with a shaking hand in the grey spring light of Frosthold, and the moment his seal pressed into the wax beside Elira's blood mark and Kaelin's black wolf, the machinery of Lord Malachar Ashcroft's downfall began to turn, silent and irreversible, 300 miles to the south. But the story was not finished, because a strategist as thorough as Elira does not leave a wounded predator at her back, and she had known from the beginning that Malachar would not simply accept ruin. He would come. And he did, but not in the way he intended. Word of the Frosthold Charter could not be kept secret, and it reached Ashfell within a fortnight, and Malachar, that patient, smiling man, understood in an instant what Alaric had failed to understand for 6 years. That he had been outmaneuvered not by a rival lord with an army, but by a woman with a ledger, and that the kingdom he had spent a fortune conquering had just turned to ash in his hands. He did the thing that cornered predators do. He gathered what warriors remained loyal to Ashcroft Coin, and he marched, not on Night River, which was too strong and too far, but on the western holdfasts, meaning to seize by force the silver route the charter had granted them, and to hold it hostage against Elira's accord. It was a desperate move, the move of a man who had run out of clever ones, and Elira had anticipated it, precisely because it was the only move left. She had not spent 6 months building an army because she did not need one. She had spent 6 months building relationships and honoring debts and making herself the woman to whom the North owed its good fortune. And when Malachar's warriors rode into the western reaches expecting frightened holdfast lords, they found instead the combined levies of Night River and the river clans, and the very holdfasts they meant to conquer, all bound together by treaties in Elira's hand, all fighting not for a king, but for the woman who had fed them and paid them, and kept faith with them when the crown had not. Malachar's army was not defeated in a great battle. It simply dissolved, the way his son-in-law's kingdom had dissolved, as the mercenaries he had bought with Ashcroft silver looked at the united North arrayed against them, and did the arithmetic themselves, and went home. And Malachar, master of Ashfell, the man who had played the longest game and very nearly won it, was taken alive at a river ford by warriors of the very holdfast he had failed to pay, and he was brought north to Frosthold in chains to stand before the woman who had unmade him. He didn't rage when they brought him before Elira in the council hall. He was not that kind of man. He looked at her for a long moment with something that was almost admiration, the professional regard of one strategist for another, and he said, "It was you all along. From the day of the marriage. You saw the whole board before any of us had made a move. I saw it in the contract, Elira said, before the ink was dry. I told Alaric he was signing away his throne. He told me jealousy was beneath a queen. Malachar laughed, a low, genuine laugh. He was a fool. I knew he was a fool. That's why I chose him. I built my entire design on his foolishness, what I did not account for. And here the old lord inclined his head, a small grave gesture of respect. Was that he was foolish enough to discard the one person on the board more dangerous than I was. That was not in my calculations. A man does not, as a rule, hand his enemy the only weapon that can kill him and then send her away to learn how to use it. No, Elira agreed. As a rule, he does not. And she looked at this man, this predator who had schemed to swallow kingdoms, who had used his own daughter as a blade and his son-in-law as a whetstone, and she found that she felt toward him none of the hatred she might have expected. He had been honest, at least, in his ambition. He had never pretended to love her and then thrown her away. He had simply reached for everything and missed, and now he sat in chains in her hall, waiting to learn his fate. And Elira, who had refused every cheap revenge for 6 long months, made her final decision the way she made all her decisions, strategically, and with a mercy that was itself a kind of dominance. "I'm not going to execute you, Malachar," she said, and she watched surprise flicker across his composed face. A dead schemer becomes a martyr, and his allies plot in his name. A living one, stripped of everything, becomes a warning. You'll return to Ashfell, but Ashfell will no longer be yours. Your lands and your levies and your silver will be divided among the holdfasts you failed to pay and the clans you tried to conquer, held in charters bound to my blood mark, exactly as everything else in the north is now bound. You'll live in a small house on a small holding, and you'll watch, every day, the prosperity of a north you'll never again touch, ruled by treaties you can't break, enriched by a silver river you'll never again taste. You wanted to hold the north. You'll spend the rest of your life watching me hold it instead. That's your sentence, and it's crueler than death, and we both know it." Malachar was silent for a long moment. Then he inclined his head one final time and said, "You would have made a magnificent conqueror, Luna." "I'm not a conqueror," Elira said. "I'm a builder. That's the difference between us, and it's why I won." And she had him taken away, not to a dungeon, but to the long, slow humbling she had designed for him. And as the doors closed behind the fallen lord of Ashfell, Elira sat for a moment in the quiet of the hall she had earned, and felt no triumph, only a great and settled calm, the calm of a woman who has finished a long and difficult piece of work, and found that it holds. There remained the matter of Seraphine, and of Alaric, and of the ruined marriage that had begun the whole cascade, and Elira did not have to seek them out, because the collapse she had engineered brought them to her door of their own accord. Seraphine came first, and she came alone, which told Elira much. The Iron Bride arrived at Frosthold in early summer, no longer gowned in silver, no longer flanked by her father's power. A woman of perhaps 25, who had been raised to believe herself the most important person in every room she entered, and had learned, in the space of a single terrible year, that she had never been anything more than a piece her father moved across a board. She stood in the council hall, where her whole family's ambition had come to ruin, and she looked at Elira, the woman she had once needled in palace corridors, the wall she had helped knock down, and whatever cruel and clever thing she had rehearsed to say died in her throat. because there is no needling a woman who holds the fate of your entire bloodline in her folded hands. My father is finished, Seraphine said at last. My husband is a beggar. The kingdom I was married into is a charity case, fed by your mercy. I have nothing. You have your life, Elira said, which is more than you'd have left me if our places were reversed and you'd held the winning hand. Don't mistake me for you, Seraphine. I know exactly what you would have done to me, given the power I have now. That's precisely why I'm not going to do it to you. Seraphine's composure cracked, just slightly, and Elira saw beneath the iron the frightened young woman who had been raised as a weapon and was only now, in her ruin, beginning to wonder whether she might have been a person instead. Why did you come here? Elira asked, not unkindly. You didn't come to gloat, and you didn't come to beg, or you'd have led with it. Why? And Seraphine, to her credit, told the truth. Because you're the only person in the world who understands what it is to be discarded by that court and survive it. My father used me. Alaric used me. I was never a Luna. I was a bridge, and I've been walked across, and now I'm standing on the far side of it with nothing, and I don't know how to build anything, because no one ever taught me. They only taught me how to be beautiful and how to obey. And I looked at what you did, at everything you built out of the same nothing they left me with, and I thought. She stopped and looked away, and finished in a smaller voice than Elira had ever heard from her. I thought maybe you'd tell me how. It was, Elira reflected later, the last thing she had expected, and the truest test of the woman she had become. She could have sent Seraphine away with the contempt the younger woman had once shown her. It would have been just. Instead, Elira looked at this hollow, decorative creature who had been the instrument of her betrayal, and she saw not a rival, but a casualty, a girl broken on the same wheel that had nearly broken her, and she made the choice that separates those who survive cruelty from those who merely reproduce it. Sit down, Elira said. I won't make you a Luna, and I won't make you a strategist. That's earned, not given, and it takes years, and I don't yet know whether you have the spine for it. But I'll give you what no one gave me, a place to start, and honest work, and the chance to prove you're something more than what your father made you. There's a river clan holding that needs a steward who can read a ledger. It's cold and it's hard, and no one will bow to you there. If you want it, it's yours. If you'd rather go back south and be beautiful in a dying court, that road's open too. Choose. Seraphine chose the holding. Elira never fully softened toward her, and Seraphine never became a friend. But over the seasons that followed, the Iron Bride learned to keep a ledger and mend a fence and speak plainly to hard people, and slowly, imperfectly, she became someone her father would not have recognized and would not have valued, which was the surest sign she had become someone worth being. Alaric was the last to come, and he came in autumn, a full year after the night he had told his queen to disappear gracefully. He was no longer a king. The charter had left Highmark a small, honest kingdom fed by the North's mercy, and its lords, learning at last where their prosperity truly came from, had quietly stripped Alaric of all but the title and installed a council to do the governing he had never had the wit for. He came to Frosthold not to bargain, for he had nothing left to bargain with, but simply, he said, to say the thing he had crossed 300 miles to say. He stood before Elira in the hall, an aging man in plain clothes, and he said, I was wrong. Not about the trade or the treaties or any of the arithmetic you always saw, and I never did. I was wrong about you. I had the best thing that will ever happen to me, and I called it useful, and I threw it on a pillow beside a crown, and I have spent every day since understanding, a little more, exactly what I did. I don't want anything, Elira. There's nothing left for me to want. I only wanted you to hear me say it. I'm sorry. Not because I lost, because you deserved better. And I was too much of a fool to be it. And Elira looked at the man she had once loved with the whole of her underestimated heart, and she found that the wound he had made in her had, at some point over the long seasons of building and winning and choosing mercy, quietly healed, leaving only a scar and the wisdom scars carry. I know you are, she said, and I forgive you, Alaric, not because you've earned it, but because carrying it costs me more than it costs you, and I've better things to build than a grudge. But hear the rest of it, because you crossed 300 miles, and you should take the whole truth home. You didn't lose me because Seraphine was more beautiful, or because Malachar offered more iron. You lost me the moment you decided that the person who loved you and served you and made you great was worth less than the person who flattered you and cost you nothing. That's the mistake, not the woman, the measure. You measured worth by what a thing looked like, instead of what it did. And a man who measures wrong will lose everything he has, every time, forever, no matter how many chances he's given. Go home. Live well if you can. And if the goddess ever grants you another loyal thing, a friend, a counselor, a dog, for the love of everything, this time, know what you're holding. Alaric bowed his head, and he left the way he had come, smaller than he arrived, and Elira watched the door close behind him, and felt nothing but the quiet of a debt finally settled and set down. She did not marry Cailan that year, or the next. There was no need to hurry a thing that grew stronger for being unforced, and when at last they stood together before the black pines, and the pack that had become her people, it was not a bond that seized them like fever, but a choice they made in daylight, with clear eyes, two equals, who had each been thrown away by someone who could not count, and had found in each other the rare and radical thing of being correctly valued. The North prospered. The Silver River ran, and the holdfasts grew fat, and children who would never know hunger were born in Frosthold to storemasters who could read, and every treaty that held it all together was written in one tight, precise hand that forgot nothing and forgave only what was wise to forgive. They never did make Elira a queen again. She had learned that the title was the cage, and the work was the crown, and she wore the work until the end of her long life, and the North called her simply the strategist, and meant by it the thing that no court had ever meant when it called her useful. So hear the whole of it, you who have listened this far. The world is full of people who will measure you by how you look across a hall, and never once by what you carry when the roof begins to fall. They will call you useful and mean it as a leash. And when they set you down beside something that glitters, remember Elira, who did not scream and did not beg, who walked out the door with a healer's token and a stubborn heart and built an empire out of everything they threw away. Do not waste your strength convincing the blind to see. Simply go and build and let the arithmetic do the rest.